Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Barry C. Lynn presenting his book, Liberty from All Masters, The New American Autocracy versus the Will of the People, in conversation with Zephyr Teachout. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account, and just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Liberty from All Masters on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. And we thank you so much for showing up and for tuning in support of our authors and of our tremendous staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We truly appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. We hope they don't, but if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. We thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speakers. Barry C. Lynn is founder and CEO of the Open Markets Institute in Washington, D.C. He is author of the books Cornered and End of the Line, in which he pioneered coverage and analysis of America's new monopoly crisis. His work has been profiled in the New York Times, Politico, the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, the New Yorker, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, and CBS. Zephyr Teachout is an associate law professor at Fordham Law School. She was a death penalty defense lawyer at the Center for Death Penalty Litigation in North Carolina and co-founded a nonprofit dedicated to providing trial experience to new law school graduates. She has written dozens of law review articles and essays and 2 books, Corruption in America and the recent Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. Tonight, they'll be discussing Barry Lynn's new book, Liberty from All Masters, The New American Autocracy versus the Will of the People. Liberty from All Masters addresses the serious risk to American liberties presented by the extreme and fast-growing concentration of economic power, particularly in online monopolists such as Amazon and Google. The starred review in Kirkus Reviews praises Liberty from All Masters as admonitory, cautionary, and essential. I'm honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Barry and Zephyr.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who are here. Thank you to Harvard Bookstore. And thank you to Barry, not only for giving me the opportunity to do this online Q&A, but for your incredible visionary brain understanding of America. This is the book that we're going to be talking about tonight, Liberty from All Masters. It's an astonishing book. It's beautifully written. It is incredible. It covers an incredible sweep of history with really powerful details, but most importantly, a really compelling story about how to understand how we understand ourselves and how we got to this moment we are in this country. Those of you who are here are so lucky. And I feel lucky because Barry personally has probably had the single biggest impact of any intellectual mentor, surely has, that I've ever had. When I was introduced to his work in 2010, it really was sort of one of those light bulb coming off moments. It changed the way that I saw politics. It changed the way that I understood inequality. It changed the way that I looked at labor markets. It changed sort of, it was like putting on a different different classes, that powerful. And Barry's that role, that sort of transformative role, and I see as I'm saying this that the shades are changing. So this is the like embodying the different colored glasses. He's played this really central, critical role for so many people. This sort of transformative, revelatory role who have come to anti-monopoly through Barry's work, and then gone on to be at the heart of the recent congressional investigation, at the heart of a growing, very exciting anti-monopoly movement that is at the state level and the federal level and is really changing people's understanding of what is going on and what we can do about it. So it's a real personal honor to be able to be here. And one other thing, just in case you, one more sort of fun fact about Barry, or tragic fun, is that his first book, End of the Line, and his first writing was about fragility in our global economic system. And he basically, essentially, laid out what could happen if there was a pandemic. And what would happen. He actually even wrote about face masks and face mask shortages when other people weren't thinking about some of the, the real fragilities brought on by concentrated power. So before we get into talking about this book, though, I think myself and so many people who are here are like in this moment of relief, excitement, uncertainty about politics. And I kind of want to turn to Barry and talk about what's happening right now with the anti-monopoly movement that you have played such a crucial role in spurring, before we get into the ideas in this book.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you, Zephyr. That was probably the kindest introduction I've ever had in my life. And it's, these last 10 years of working together have, we've made a difference. So we haven't won yet, but we have gotten people at least notice. It's it's a great question to start with, because it's like, where are we? And, where we are, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at in the book, is, we are facing today, honestly, perhaps what is the gravest threat to American democracy, to personal liberty that we have seen in this country since the Civil War. And it's because of the power of Google, and the power of Facebook, and the power of Amazon. And, it's the way they use that power, and the way they sort of manipulate individuals, and manipulate how individuals interact with each other. And it's really terrifying. I mean, but on the other hand, what we also see is this awakening. I mean, it's really, as you know, it began 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, in some ways, it began with your race in New York in 2014. That's when it started to hit the headlines. But it really sort of accelerated about 4 years ago when Senator Warren gave a big speech about this issue. But just in the last while, we've seen this fundamentally important report by the antitrust subcommittee in the House of Representatives, the Cicilline Committee in the House of Representatives, that really lays out the problem and what to do about it in a way that provides us a guide for how we go forward. This is, we have a blueprint for the first time from the U.S. Congress about what to do, and it was a blueprint that was pretty much accepted by the Republicans, the same as the Democrats on the subcommittee. And we also have this incredible a case against Google that was announced by the Department of Justice just a couple of weeks ago. So here we are with this truly terrifying problem, and we should all be terrified. But we also see people standing up and fighting for the first time, and doing it with real confidence that we are going to win.
So one of the things that you do sort of amazingly well in the book, and I'm going to ask you to do a kind of Shakespeare in 30 seconds version, maybe not 30 seconds, few minutes, but is you basically really persuasively argue that there is a history that we're all missing. or that we are not all, but that the sort of mainstream understanding of our own history has missed. And so even if somebody today is saying, you know, railing at pharma monopolies or railing at Amazon, they're missing these like incredible strains of thinking about democracy and monopoly power and corporate power that we've missed. So can you give a short version of that secret history that I know I just want to say, I know that it's a terrifying book, but it's also actually a very inspiring book, because when you see that history, it actually gives you tools to address the current moment.
Yeah, and it's you know, this is something, you know, in writing my last book, in writing Cornered, I traced the history of anti-monopolism in the United States, you know, many decades back, more than a century back. But in this book, what I really did is I took it all the way back to the founding. And I really studied the founding in the light of what I know about anti-monopolism. And what I kind of discovered is that, you know, to a very real extent, you know, America was created, or the first American citizens created this country to fight monopoly. And they did it because they had a certain vision of human liberty. And the way to achieve that liberty was by sort of addressing power and regulating power to sort of ensure that there were limits on how people could compete with each other. So that's where competition policy comes from. That's where, you know, all the regulation of power comes from, is to ensure that there was a certain amount of protection each individual possessed to think the way they wanted to act the way they wanted to do business the way they wanted to. And, you know, and I call this in the book, I call it the American system of liberty, that there was this sort of founding of a system of liberty and to sort of ensure this sort of these individual abilities to interact and do business and speak with one another. And that this was what we really perfected in this country over the course of 200 years, was building and refining this system so that it worked in an era of railroads, so that it worked in an era of telegraph and telephone, so that it worked in an era of heavy industry, big modern industry. So even then, when there was radical, revolutionary technological change, we still had the same political balances. So the history of the United States, this sort of secret history, this lost history, is that America is anti-monopoly. And it's foundational to democracy. You know, we know that the Constitution is foundational to our liberty in the political sense, but anti-monopoly is the extension of the Constitution to the political economy. So we have seen the Constitution tested just in recent days. It's continuing to be tested right now. We know that it is strong. We know that it's going to prevail, that we have the ability to make it prevail. But we also have to understand is that we have this amazing set of tools that allows us to do this in the political economy as well, to prevail against all autocrats, all powerful corporations. This is our society, it's our economy, it's our nation. And if we study our history, we can learn how to make it ours again.
So one of the things that's so interesting about there's a lot of oppositions in the book that are really interesting. And I want to ask you about two of them. One is this sort of central opposition between consumer and citizen. And the other, and you can deal with in whichever order you want, the other, which feels maybe a lot more uncomfortable and strange for people, is liberty and price discrimination. So it's like, okay, consumer, citizen, I can see those, but what on earth does price discrimination have to do with freedom?
Yeah, so I'll start with the easier one, and it's there's I tell a story actually about in this thing that about 10 years ago, these people who were studying an early draft of the Declaration of Independence, they came upon there's a place where Jefferson scratched out a word, and then he wrote atop that word the word citizen, but they didn't know what was in the word below it. And they x-rayed this sort of early draft of the Declaration. I discovered that the word underneath was the word subject. And Jefferson was like he scratched it out violently. It was like by far the most sort of extreme strikeout in the entire document. And actually, in his sort of life of writing, as far as people could tell. Now, the reason he did that is because he was creating a new vision of what a citizen is, of what an individual is, which is, a subject it exists below the state. A citizen is the state, as a part of the state. A subject has to petition power. A citizen grants power. So as a part of the revolution was this radical redefinition of the individual. It was this re-understanding of what it is to be a human being, of what it is that we expect. And it was that American system of liberty was built to protect this new vision of the individual as a citizen. That's what, So that's like essential for us to understand what America is and how it works. Now, consumer, there's a long history of where the word comes from, but the key thing to understand is that our competition policies, our antitrust policies, our anti-monopoly policies, 40 years ago, they were turned upside down. All of this vast body of law, all of these institutional structures that we had built were entirely revolutionized with another striking out of a word and writing in of a word atop that. And in this case, the word that was struck out was the word citizen. And the word that was written above it was the word consumer. And this was in the early days of neoliberalism. It was Robert Bork. This was, and in the early days of the Reagan administration, what folks said is, well, rather than using this word citizen to structure how we use all of our anti-monopoly laws, we're going to use this other word, consumer, to structure all this great body of law. And they actually did this through the guidelines that we used to understand these laws. So, and at the time, no one noticed. It was like this little tiny scratch out. Citizen, consumer, who cares? But it took this grand body of law. It took American liberty and flipped it on its head. And here we are 40 years later, 35 years later, and we wake up, we find everything is messed up. All power is concentrated in every part of our political economy. We got Google, Facebook, Amazon, this massive concentration. We wonder, how did this happen? And the key lesson is that in this case, ideas really matter. And we have to get our ideas right. And so, words matter, ideas matter, and that's why it's actually, we need to understand our history so we understand just how important it is to make sure that, that we have the right people sort of using these laws in the right way.
So I'm going to come back to my second question, but I just want to jump in to say that one of the reasons that I came to anti-monopoly is because of democracy work. It's actually the reason. And sort of realizing that if we treated these sort of the only tools that we could use to protect self-government were campaign finance laws, and they're powerful tools, and there's a lot more we can do with them, that they alone couldn't be enough. We had to not just deal with how much you could spend, but power itself and how power was accumulated. So I want to ask another history question, but just to get people a sense of grounding, as we're a few minutes, 20 minutes in, is can you just talk about what the tools are? Because I think sometimes people think they understand, but one of the revelations of your book is that we need a broader understanding of what this anti-monopoly vision is and a fuller sense of what the suite of tools are. And you do such a beautiful job of talking about how the same tools can be repurposed in different eras.
Yeah, and actually, before I do that, I mean, it's like your book on corruption, Corruption in America, which is published by Harvard. I know this is an independent bookstore, but still, there's some family connection there. It is actually just a terrific, important discussion of power, and so So
I finished it while being a fellow at Barry's shop in DC. So yes. Anyway, but can you just give people sort of a sense of like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. And it's a good question, because people always think, well, you're talking about anti-monopoly, you're talking about breaking monopoly. That means you're breaking things up, you know, and breaking things up is a fundamental importance. Breaking things up is a way for us to say, hey, we got the power. We're bigger than you. We, the people, are bigger than you. We can go. And this is actually, you know, the title of your new book, Break Them Up. It's a way, you chose that because it's a way of empowering the reader. We can do this. It's easy.
I love it, but the error is that sometimes people then get a limited sense of what anti-monopoly is. And your book is a really important for people. If you think you know what anti-monopoly is, it's been breaking up.
So what I wanted to do with this book is actually sort of, you know, there's the Sherman Act, which was passed in 1890. You know, that was like, that's the Break 'em Up Act, right? And let's make them smaller. Let's protect market structure. But there was another piece of legislation before that, the Interstate Commerce Act, which is what we regulated the railroads with. And that was, you know, what I argue was even more fundamental. And the reason was fundamental was to say, well, if in cases where there is a monopoly, an essential monopoly, like a railroad or a telegraph system or a telephone system, or that there's one thing that we want to see out of that corporation, which is that they treat everybody the same. That there's never that they never favor one company over another, that they never favor one person over another, that they give everyone the same price, and they give everyone the same terms of service, and they treat people in the order in which they come to market. And that's the foundation of rule of law. Like if you allow for a monopoly to pick and choose who it treats and how it treats them, then actually what you have is the rule of man, a rule of human beings over other human beings, rule of whim, of fancy, of you have an arbitrary system. And then it's a big problem when you have a system of arbitrary power. And that's what we have actually today with Google. That's what we have with Facebook and Amazon, is these corporations, we never apply to them the common carriage rules that we talk about in the Interstate Commerce Act, that we established in the Interstate Commerce Act. So, and they now have the ability to, you know, treat different companies, different corporations differently. And that's what makes them so fantastically dangerous, is they connect people with who they want to connect people to. They can vanish who they want to vanish. I mean, we hear the Republicans talking about this all the time. You know, it's been part of what the Trumpies have been. It's true. This is a huge danger. But the thing is, we do have this amazing set of tools that we can fix it with.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes that people get so sort of their eyes glaze over a little bit with tech, and they think because it's tech, we can't actually use our history. And you do a really incredible job of just being like, nope, we've used these tools for new technologies before, and really, and I find as a lawyer found very moving, showing the way in which this is an attack on law, attack on the sort of the principle of equality in law. There's another secret history that's also really important, and I want you to talk a little bit about, because when I think if you're here, when you may think about anti-monopoly, the few figures that may come to mind, maybe the wrong figures. If you want to read about why Teddy Roosevelt is not the antitrust hero you think he is, this is a great book for that. But you also hear about primarily white people. And there's a really important intellectual and movement history of Black leaders and anti-monopolism. And can you address that in this in a few minutes?
Yeah, no, and this is of fundamental importance, because we have these myths, and we sort of see the founding as a bunch of aristocrats, with white wigs and pantaloons, and there's that in itself is a myth. Yes, I was talking earlier about Jefferson. Madison was a key figure, but it's like we have to remember that at the founding, there were all of these folks that were along the walls of those rooms who were sort of staring at the people who had the pens in their hands. And there were people down the halls who were like sort of basically applying pressure to the men who had the pens in their hands. And there were mobs on the street. There were groups of people on the street who were sort of pressuring. So from the very first, these laws, anti-monopoly law and the laws in the United States were laws of the people. And, initially it was mainly of white people. We should be honest. But one of the things is, like, by the time you're sort of engaged fully in the fight for freedom, you have people like Frederick Douglass, sort of understanding the importance of independence of the type that, Americans fought for at the beginning, personal independence. There's a person who, I would recommend, I would strongly encourage everybody to read. There's a book called Black Reconstruction, and it's by W.E.B. Du Bois. And, I say this right at the beginning of my book, at the introduction, is there's a few great books that really inspired me in my work. I don't think there's any single book that inspired me more than Black Reconstruction, which was published in 1935. It's one of the great political books in American history about American democracy. And it's a vision of independence, of making people independent, of having the true American sort of full American liberty for every single member of society. And so this is one of this is, we see populists as being white, we see the founders as being white, but it's like anti-monopoly is very much a story of all Americans. This is a fight for all Americans, and it has always been a fight for all Americans, and it's become increasingly so in the 20th century. So it's this is, in fact, as we move forward today in fights against structural racism, as we move forward and sort of fights to sort of rebuild liberty for all Americans, this is, anti-monopoly is one of the key tools. And actually, you address this in your book as well. It's in a really beautiful chapter.
Well, there were speaking of Du Bois, there are two anecdotes. I learned a lot in this book. I told Barry after I read it, I thought I knew your brain. I didn't even know the fraction of it. So I really, there's so many wonderful details and insights. But there's two around Woodrow Wilson that I found particularly interesting. One was that Du Bois initially supported him. And Du Bois, an anti-monopolist, supported Wilson's anti-monopoly vision, and then later was understandably extremely disappointed. The other, which I thought was such an amazing moment and very relevant to today, is that after Wilson signed the Clayton Act, significantly strengthening the initial Sherman Act, he sent his pen. We're talking a lot about pens tonight. He sent his pen to Gompers, the head of the AFL. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions today is the sense that anti-monopoly and labor are somehow different issues. Why did Gompers care about anti-monopoly laws, and why should people who are very concerned about labor today be very focused on what Biden does on anti-monopoly?
Yeah, no, this is, there's probably no more important thing for us to do today than to bring together labor law and anti-monopoly law, because it's really the same thing. It's like, anti-monopoly law is really how the people prevent the capitalists from creating unions of capital, of joining all their power together into sort of, single combinations that allow them to dictate to us. So it's like anti-monopoly law is break the union of the capitalists. That's one way to look at anti-monopoly law. Now, what the capitalists want to do is they want to break the unions of working people, and it's just because if working people are scattered, then they can't counter the actions of the monopolists. So this Americans going back to the beginning, Americans have understood that these things are the same things. It's like that anti-monopoly, like allowing for little people, working people, to create unions is one way to counter the power of big people. And so, with the Sherman Act, after the Sherman Act was passed in 1890, what happened is it was designed to break the power of big corporations, but then it was immediately put to bad use by those corporations to break unions. So for the first 10 years, the first 20 years, it was used mainly to break unions, to break the cooperatives of farmers. And so what Brandeis and Wilson did was they said, with the Clayton Act, we got to fix this. We got to make it so that this will never happen again. Anti-monopoly must be used against the powerful, the truly powerful, and then individuals must have a right to organize, a right to join together, a right to bring their power together. So that was why, after the signing of the Clayton Act, that pen went to Gompers, Samuel Gompers.
There's amazing new research that sort of finally justifies, although maybe doesn't need justifying, this kind of thinking, which is that a constant corporate concentration in America is costing, according to one recent investigation, $14,000 to $15,000 per year per worker, not family, per worker. And that is money going from, that would go to workers if we'd actually enforced antitrust laws over the last 40 years, that is now going to investors. We're talking about a major, major driver of like shoveling money from workers to investors. So I see that there's a couple of questions in the chat. Barry and I are going to talk for about 3 or 4, 5 more minutes, and then I'm going to take questions. So if you have questions, now is the time to pop them in, and then I'll lift them up and ask and bring them here. So what we actually missed so far in the story, I realize, is you talk about the erasure of citizen replaced by consumer. But we did have a time, a modern industrial time, where anti-monopoly laws were working, and can we have that again?
Oh yeah, I mean it's like they are starting to work again, and and we should understand, it's like anti-monopoly laws is not just a matter of taking big things and bringing them down, or bringing them under control. It's actually to do things like, it's to make it easier for working people, because you were just talking about working people, to move around, and one of this issue that you brought up about like wages is like, it's every single person in the United States now is earning less than it's not just that you pay more for when a monopolist is in control, you actually bring home less. They're going to like just use their power in ways to pay you less. Going forward, we have right now, the tools we have are perfectly fixed for this moment. It's just because these are tools that are sort of based on principles, so we could use them at the founding vis-a-vis, great landholders. We were able to use the same basic tools, the same principles against the railroad barons and the steamship barons of the mid 19th century. We use them again in the 20th century against the Standard Oil and against to regulate communications and the giant industrial firms of the 20th century. So, really what we're doing now is we're just taking the same principles and applying them to, where we are today. Now, the technologies change, but people don't change. Relations between people don't change. There's going to be always an effort by some people to screw other people. That's, it's the nature of human society. Now, there's also cooperation that takes place. So what you want to do is if you get the law right, you have less effort to for one group to harm the other group. You have more working together in a cooperative way. That's what good competition policy gets.
Yeah. So, wow, I've got a lot else, but I see there's some really interesting questions in the chat. I guess before we go there, you are not claiming, just to be clear, that this is an issue. that we should address. This is a very ambitious book and a very ambitious project. It's a project that I that I share with you in. But one of the most likely responses I often get are people saying, "Oh, that's great. After I deal with my issue that I'm already working on, after I deal with the particular sort of abusive practice, then I'll deal with anti-monopoly." Or to sort of still keep that in the land of like, okay, that's nice, but I hope those economists keep working on it. I mean, you essentially make a claim that this is the operating system, that we have a monopoly operating system, and that is why it is so dangerous. It's not instances. It's not just Google. It's not just big tech. It is a way of organizing society. And so make your pitch that this is the operating system and not just an issue.
Yeah, no, it's really, I mean, we saw this, it's a fundamental importance. And we saw this 4 years ago with the Hillary campaign, and we've seen this actually with the Biden campaign, which is, they have these little boxes of, policies, and they say we got a policy for healthcare, and we got a policy for food and farming, and we got a policy, for transportation, and then we have a little, box for our antitrust policy. As if somehow this is, it's just one little, piece of the entire political economy. But the thing about competition policy is that it underlays everything, because, I mean, if we look at it as being constitutional in nature, what's the purpose of the Constitution? The Constitution is, we built the Constitution to regulate how we compete with each other, to prevent people from gathering too much power, to ensure that all power is always accountable. And, and we'll use that to regulate all of our political actions. The basic principles of the Constitution regulate all of our political actions with each other in our society. That's the same thing with anti-monopoly, with the American system of liberty, is that these laws regulate all of our interactions in the political economy. They're foundational when it comes to healthcare, transportation, food and farming, retail, communications. Like, everything that we do is regulated by how we interact as individuals is regulated by these laws. So if we want to fix any of these things, whatever it is that you care about most, it's been made worse by the consolidation we've seen over the last 35 years. It's in some cases, it is created directly by this consolidation. So there's hardly a major ill. There's really no major ill.
Yeah.
That it will not be made easier to fix once we get back to doing anti-monopoly right.
So there's a lot of great questions. There's two that are somewhat similar. So I'll ask you to address those about Facebook. So, okay, Barry, what would you do with Facebook, say, is one version? And then what would a broken up Facebook or Google look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll deal with the second one. So like a broken up Facebook, there's a couple of different ways you'd want to break up Facebook. I mean, Facebook a few years ago took over WhatsApp. Before that it took over Instagram. One of the easiest thing to do would be to break up, force the spin off of Instagram and WhatsApp. So then you have three networks instead of one. Now that doesn't solve all your problems, but it does reduce the power of Facebook. Now, once you reduce the power of Facebook by breaking it up, you want to make sure that each of these platforms is neutral, that it treats everybody the same, that it's not manipulated, that the people are in charge of the platform and not the platform in charge of the people. And that's where our, the anti-discrimination laws come into play. Yeah, and it's just, so that if there's going to be personalization on these systems, it's controlled by the person. Now, Google's even more interesting because Google's a cluster of monopolies, so you've got, with Google, you've got a mapping monopoly, you've got a search monopoly, and you've got an email monopoly, and you've got YouTube, and you've got Chrome, and you've got Android, and then you've got all of the technologies that go into their ad system, the advertising system. And Well, if we look in our past, one of the things, there's a model from 1913. Model from 1913 is what the Wilson administration did with AT&T. And they said, AT&T, you control both the telephone system and you control Western Union and the telegraph system. You can't have both. We're going to split these apart. And they did. They split these apart. So if you're going to do this to Google, and which we shall, what we're going to do is we're going to say, YouTube does not need to be connected to Maps. Maps does not need to be connected to Android. Android does not need to be connected to Chrome. Each of these monopolies can be separate. And once they're separate, we're going to make sure they're neutral. So we are going to have all the great things in Google after this. We're going to have all the great things that Facebook brings us. What we're going to do is we're going to have none of the bad stuff, none of the manipulation, none of the theft, none of the bullying, none of the disinformation. We can get rid of all the bad and have all the good and have a lot more good with it.
So Dale has asked a series of questions. I'm going to highlight one just because it relates directly to this question, as long as we're in the Facebook Google. He says, he says broken up or public utility? So how do you think about what you're describing in relationship to the phrase public utility?
Yeah, and this is, public utility is there's sometimes, we may use the word utility. What we're generally looking at is, in the United States, generally what we want is we want private actors on one side and then the public on the other. And we have all these laws that allow us to neutralize the private actors, to get them to, so that they are not able to engage in this kind of manipulation of individuals, through the common carrier laws, for instance. So you can get them to act like utilities without actually having them belonging to and under direct governance by the government. So what you end up with is, from my point of view, sort of the best of both worlds. Is you have an air gap. You have a private corporation here, and you got the government here, and we, the people, can watch. We can use the government to regulate the private corporation, and sometimes, it's like, but we can also sometimes say, no, that's wrong. So this allows us to understand and see what's going on. Whereas if you have the government and the private corporation together in a utility model, it becomes very hard for us to see what's going on here. Separate them out, watch how it's happening, and it makes it vastly safer.
So both Jerry and Anonymous want some comment on Prop 22. And the one question is, do you want to say something about the labor effect of the Uber Lyft law that passed in California? And Anonymous had a similar question, which is, with the passing of Prop 22, is there a new precedent set for how corporations can bend labor laws to their own benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's, that was a pretty disturbing outcome from, last Tuesday's elections. It does apply only to California, and it is there's many alternative models for where we go from there. It's really the first iteration, the first major battle in that fight. So my sense is, and it wasn't, and to be fair, it wasn't actually it was not a super well written law. The language was perhaps, it picked enemies where it didn't need to pick enemies. It upset other, it made people concerned about other parts of the political economy. But the outcome was, if you're an Uber driver, a Lyft driver, was pretty disturbing. There's a lot of different pathways for dealing with this. And people have immediately, that's the thing about these laws. Is law is almost infinitely malleable. So when you lose in one, so when you lose in one area, it's like you can just come back to an entirely different direction. So we're going to get this right.
I would say, I thought that was probably the most depressing thing that happened on the election night. We're still in the balance on the Senate, but the Prop 22 was really disappointing, and it was really disappointing that Democratic leaders were at best silent. And a lot of nonprofits spoke up in favor of. It's a real problem. We have to look at how big corporations spend money to get this attention. But if you can find a little point of light, it's that we're now doing anti-monopoly at the state level. We're doing it. It's part of policy. It's part of what you ask your state lawmaker. It's not sort of over there. We're in it, and it's very connected to labor. There's Stephen is a little dispirited, perhaps. He says, is there any hope that government lawyers won't be outgunned by the corporations and elite law firms? Won't a lot of companies just try to outlast and exhaust government action?
That's also a great question, and it gets into a whole issue which we don't really have time to get into, which is actually how big law is sort of in bed with big corporations, and right now it's the entire structure of big law makes it very hard for the people to have good lawyers on their side, and there's a lot of great lawyers out there who are fighting really terrific fights on behalf of the people. Sometimes they're doing it in the pay of large corporations. Many of our friends, do this. So it's at the end of the day, well, here's one way to understand how the political economy is structured right now is you got Google, Facebook, and Amazon on top of everything. But the thing about Google, Facebook, and Amazon is, out of the Fortune 500, these three corporations, out of the rest of the Fortune 500, 497, the next 497 all hate Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So these people have a lot of lawyers, and they got a lot of money, and they got a lot of power. But the next 497 corporations out there, they got a lot of lawyers, a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of senators on their side. So if you do the math right, it actually starts to look really, really good for us.
Before I get to the next question, I just want to emphasize that, because one of the things that all of Barry's books do is they show how a combination of power and thought and ideas can be transformative. So the power map he's just described is there. The thing that is changing, but not fully changed yet, is how people understand what is possible and how people see anti-monopoly and how they get blinded by language of efficiency to actually stop enforcing these sort of core democratic principles. You're going to love this book. Okay, so Dale, I'm going to get to one more of your questions, I promise. I really appreciate you getting in there, and we could go out for a coffee afterward if we were in person. Elaine wants to know, okay, so you separate some of these monopolies. What's to prevent finance from rolling them up in different combinations or selling off tech to foreign competitors that aren't under US regulation? And I just want to say, if you want to, Barry's work on trade and connecting this to trade is so important. But answer Elaine's question.
Yeah, no, I mean, anti-monopoly is designed. Once you break them up, there will be efforts to bring them back together. And a lot of people look at what happened to AT&T the last time we broke it up. Because we've broken up AT&T actually 3 times now. So the last time we did it in 1982, it came back together. It was brought back together. It didn't come back together. So people think, okay, well, isn't that inevitable? But it was brought back together after 1982 because we stopped doing antitrust law. That's what allowed the financiers to bring it back together. If you have a rigorous antitrust regime, that's not going to be a problem. It's because it will be the conglomerate makers will be prevented from making the next conglomerate by law, by the enforcement of law. So it's.
You think, sometimes when people talk about foreign competition, it suggests to me they actually don't believe in open markets, that they actually believe top-down is better. They say, well, we need a big national Facebook to compete against the Chinese. And to me, that embodies a belief that is actually the better way to do innovation. What do you hear in that?
Yeah, no, and I think what people should understand is you should be encouraged. If we actually, when we get sufficient power accumulated in ourselves, when enough of us come together to break Google, break Amazon, break Facebook, as we shall, we'd be awful foolish if we just let the Chinese internet corporations come across our border after that. So we would use the same concentration of power. We'd use the same rules to protect ourselves against the Chinese corporations as we've used to protect ourselves against the American corporations. So this is something that the big tech folks push all the time. Oh, you don't break us up, because then you'll be turning the government, the world over to the Chinese. It's actually one of the most silly arguments that they make. It's one of the most desperate arguments they make. So don't listen to that.
So I'm going to get to another question, but I want to say other little tidbits and fun things you will get in this book is a fascinating critique of Piketty, a fascinating story of Robert Reich's change. He has not been the same. He's had a real transformation. And also, what does John Milton have to do with big tech? It's all in this book. All right. Okay. More skepticism, not depression in Anonymous. What's the effective way for legislators to break up big tech if they don't understand how tech works?
Actually, it's a great question. And the thing about anti-monopoly, and this is what, going back to the very beginning, anti-monopoly was created for people who don't understand how other things work. It's the people's law. And so the rules are set up so that you don't, what we're going to do is we're going to create structures so we don't have to understand what's going on inside the telephone company. We don't have to understand really how the railroads really work. We don't have to understand, what's happening inside of IBM. We don't have to understand what's going on inside of Google and Facebook. We just have to know what the structure of power needs to look like in order to protect ourselves. So these laws don't actually, have proven remarkably good at allowing for the technologies to be developed, for the scientists and engineers to better these technologies and bring better services and products to market while protecting against the power. And so that's the beauty of simple rules, is we just focus on misuse of power. And we don't have to create a big regulatory state. We don't need the biggest brains to understand how this works. That's the beauty of it.
So we're going to get to my last question, which also is echoed in both another of Dale's and Arturo's. But before we do, two of your last questions dealt with something that I'd love you to address so that we're ready. That people have been very focused on Trump. I've been seeing it as a sort of Scylla and Charybdis. It's like these two forms of tyranny. But now, as we turn to face this economy with growing excitement around anti-monopoly at all levels of government, what are the arguments? Can you sort of give us a taxonomy of what you expect to hear? Because we're talking about power, and power isn't going to give it up easily. So what are they going to tell us? And why are they?
Yeah, well, the first thing they're going to tell us it's hopeless. They want us to despair. They want us to think that we're never going to be able to do this. They want us to feel powerless. They want us to think, well, the world has permanently changed and I have to adapt myself to the new structure of the world, rather than I have the ability to gather arm in arm with my neighbors and to use our power to build the world that we want and to force them to adapt. So the first thing that they just want us, first is just, it's hopeless, it's over, it's done, we're in a new world. And this is something that the monopolists have claimed, for going back, since the beginning of the railroad. It's you got to adapt to us. So, the other thing is the classic thing that they always say is that, if you stop us, you try to stop us, you're going to block innovation. There's like some fantastic new idea that's just waiting to come and just make your life perfect. And what we have seen throughout history is that these corporations, every one of them early in their days on this earth, were very innovative. Most of these corporations long ago have ceased to bring real innovation to market. Most monopolists don't do that. Monopolists kill innovation. Monopolists like to drag us backwards. So so they'll make the claim that they're innovative when the exact opposite is true. They are destroyers of innovation. And the way to get a better world is to do what we've done with every other previous monopoly, and that is to break it.
Okay, so since hopelessness is their story, and putting aside whether there is a Democratic Senate, what can Biden do as president? And what do we just have to wait until there's a Democratic Senate? And there's two questions about Biden in particular. What can the administration do?
Yeah, so I mean, the administration, it's important for folks to understand, is that we don't know what the administration is going to do. I mean, they've recognized this as a problem. They have recognized it as a real problem. We know that there's some people on the inside of the Biden team that recognize this as an existential problem. Not everyone, but some of the folks there do. The executive, this incoming administration has awesome tools. There's so much power that was built into the U.S. government to deal with private monopoly power by previous Congresses. So we have these amazing institutions which we haven't really used in generations. We have amazing laws which we haven't used in generations. They're just waiting for us to use them. So the Biden administration can, not immediately, but in the next 4 years, can establish the foundations for new democracy in America without Congress weighing in any significant way. They can do that in 4 years.
So is this what Bill Clinton did and what Barack Obama did?
Well, yeah, we should understand, it's like we're in this problem because of both parties. We didn't talk much, it's like this problem was created, the overthrow of anti-monopoly was achieved by Reagan in the early 80s, but Bill Clinton in the 90s, he's the one that completed the neoliberal revolution. And every single president since Reagan has basically followed the Reagan path. We're now, as we mentioned, people are waking up in Congress, around the world, in every state of the United States. And, so that's why there's this opportunity for Joe Biden to do something really fantastically different than we have seen in 40 years.
Still there 40 years later. So, I mean, this is really important because I and others will be pushing for overturning laws, and all of that is incredibly important. But the power within the administration, it will take spreading the profound ideas, and I really do think you will. It's the right time to read this book, because we have just come through an election, and you may be a little depressed, but it is fundamentally a hopeful book about possibility, and history can give you hope because there are tools that we can use and ways of seeing. And I think fundamentally this is a book about the power of ideas and how ideas can transform and will transform this moment. So thank you all for your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. And thank you, Barry, for writing a wonderful book.
Thanks so much to both of you for this invigorating conversation. Sorry, Barry, I didn't mean to cut in, but no, thank you. This is, I feel a lot better. Thank you so much to both of you. Thanks to all of our attendees out there for spending your evening with us. And please learn more about this fantastic book and purchase copies of Liberty from All Masters at harvard.com. Again, the link is up in the chat. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge and me beaming in from Nashville, please have a good night. Keep reading, stay sane, stay safe and healthy. And thanks so much again to both of you, Barry and Zephyr.
Hey, thank you.